right, in this video, we are going to tackle the services section. And in this section, we are going to actually do a cool hover overlay effect on our images. So let's get to it. So in my HTML, let's look at the services section. It's a section with a class of services, and then I have a div with a class of wrapper that's housing everything. And that is because I wanted to constrain the width of the entire section. Then we have an H2. Then we have a div with a class of services flexbox. I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to do with that. And in there, I have three links that contain the image, and then pretty much an H3 that will act as the link. So let's call to our wrapper. I'll scroll down and come into my little services section comment here to keep it nice and organized. I will call to wrapper. And I want this to line up perfectly with the inside part of my hero section. So I'm just going to give it the same max width. So a max width of 95%. And then I'm going to center it with margin 0 auto. Oh, what happened? Where'd that R come from? Wrapper, max width 95%. Whoa, I did max width again. Margin. There we go. So now it puts it right there, and then the S will be perfectly aligned with the edge of the services section. All right, let's call to our H2, that word of services. It is inside the services container, and it is an H2. I'm going to change the font size. And since this is a header or a heading and I want it to be a bit bigger, I'm actually also going to use a clamp. This one will be a little bit different though. The smallest I want it to get is 2 rem. I'm going to do 10% VW, viewport width, for my middle ground. And then I only ever want it to be as big as 5 rem. Okay. I'm going to add some margin to the bottom of it to push it away from the image a little bit more. Margin bottom of 5 rem. And then I'm going to add a border on the top of it. So remember, our borders, usually we've seen them on all 4 sides. However, you can add a border just to the top, left, right, whatever you want. So I'll do a border top. I'll make the color that dark color. So using our variable again, I want it to be 3 pixels thick and then solid. So that brings in sort of like a little section divider right there. And then I don't like how close the word services is to that border. So I'm going to add some padding, but just on the top of 2 rem. There we go. That looks good. All right. So looking at our browser, services is done. Also, you'll notice that memberships is also aligning perfectly with our services section and our inside section. And that is because memberships, I scroll down, also has that div with a class of wrapper. So I wanted to apply the same styles to a few different things. So I just use the same class. So I don't have to rewrite the CSS for something else. Now I also want the memberships H2 to be styled the same exact way as my services H2. So instead of retyping or copying and pasting, I'm just going to put a comma in my selector, and I'll call to the memberships H2. And there we go. So both of these have a clamp, which means they are both responsive, and they'll grow and shrink if necessary. All right, but back to the services section. So that's our H2, done and dusted. Let's call to that flex box. So I want all 3 of these images and their headings to be in a row. So I will call to services hyphen flexbox, and I will do a display flex, and that puts them all in a row. Now, taking a look at this flexbox, you'll notice that weight training is here, and it's also here. Whoa. So I have two versions of weight training, two versions of boxing, two versions of personal training. The reason will become clearer, but basically, this one right here, I want to put on top of the image, and it's going to show up when somebody hovers or focuses over that image. So we won't see it from the get-go. And then this one, just think about tablet and mobile devices. You cannot hover or focus on those devices. So that is going to be brought back and be in view for when somebody comes to this site on a mobile device. So we're actually going to get rid of it for right now since we're doing the desktop stylings. This one has a class of service underscore title underscore mobile. So the service title mobile, we will do a display of none, and it just gets rid of it. Now, the biggest problem with this is just simply remembering to bring it back once you do your tablet and mobile sizing or responsiveness styles. Okay. So this flexbox needs a little bit of work. Let's add some gap in between everything. So I'll do a gap of 10 rem. So that's going to add a lot of space in between them. My images are already responsive because remember we did that in the universal stylings, so they can grow and shrink if necessary. For this section, I also want it to be responsive like from the get-go. So I'm going to do a flex wrap of wrap. So since those images are bigger, they're going to be able to wrap onto the next line and keep their, size big. So for a smaller screen, personal training is going to get wrapped onto the second line. So I want these to be centered in the browser. Right now they aren't. If we make it really big, we have a lot of space over to the right. But watch what happens when I center it. In my flexbox, let's do a justify content center. And you'll notice that the wrapped item will also move to the center. So this is a nice way to make sure it looks good on tablet and mobile as well. It looks better to me than if it was like all the way to the left, right? And then you had like that big empty space over here. So sometimes, depending on how big your containers are, you might not need to justify content center when it's big. But if you apply a flex wrap to it and something wraps onto the next line, you can always apply justify content center for that reason alone. Okay. So that's our flex box. And since these images are so big, they're going to kind of stack on top of each other. This is, I guess, like a small laptop, big tablet kind of size that we're looking at, since I have to have it squished to see the code and browser on one side. Okay, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to move the word, the H3, so weight training, boxing, personal training, we're going to move them onto their image. In my HTML, each one of these is a link, so the idea would be somebody could click on the picture and it would take them to like a page about the weight training or boxing classes, schedules, things like that. And that link has a class of container that's housing an image and a class of overlay that has my H3 in it. So we're going to call to container. I'll scroll up a little bit. So we're going to call to container, and we are going to give this a position of relative. And then my overlay, which is my div with the H3 inside of it, we're going to position on top of it, right? So we'll do overlay. It has a class of overlay. We'll do a position of absolute. Let's bring in a background color so we can see like the whole container. Background color. I want it to be transparent so we can still see the image behind it. So I'll do RGBA. For the red, I want 195. For green, 254. For the blue, I want 92. That rhymes. And then for the alpha channel, I'll do 0.7 for 70%. So it's bringing in sort of that our lime green accent color, but with an opacity to it. All right. So let's move it onto the image. I'm going to align their bottoms. So bottom 0, we'll bring it to the bottom. I want it to take up 100% of the width of the image, of the container. And I'll do a height of 100%. Ta-da! Okay, so I've told it to be 100% of the container. However, if we zoom in, there is this tiny space right under the image. Can you see that? Do I need to enhance even more? There's this tiny space right under the image. And if you go into detective mode and you go into your developer tools, you will see that it is not margin, it is not padding, it is the content area of the image. So, where is this coming from? Because an image is an inline element, you can put an image in a paragraph and you'll see the text like come before and, you know, to the right of it, to the left of it. We have to think about the display of text, right? So, text has descenders. So think of the bottom of a lowercase p that's coming below the baseline of the text. So this little space right here is there to make room for descenders of text, since the image by default is an inline element. So let's call to the image. I'll call to container img, and I'm going to change its display to block. And it's disappeared. So we've taken it from inline to block. All right, let me zoom out. And then let's work on moving our text, right? The text for these guys. Okay, so the H3 has a class of .service_title. Let's change its color to black. Let's change it to uppercase with a text transform. Uppercase. Let's change its font size. And it's going to stay relatively small, so I won't use a clamp. I'll do 3 rem. I'm going to text align center. And that brought it into the center. However, I want it to be in the center of the image vertically as well. So I'm going to do our position of absolute, which means our container already has a position of relative, so it'll work off of the container, which is nice. So let's bring it down from the top by 50%. Bring it in from the left by 50%. All right. right. And then we have to do our transform of translate -50%, -50%. So now it'll be in the center. Okay. For this is what I want it to look like when someone's hovering over it. So we need to think about what is going to be changing from the initial state to the hover state. Basically, what I'm going to do is come back to my overlay. This overlay, we brought in the background color, we've aligned it, set the width and height. Now I'm going to change the opacity to 0 to take it away, because I don't want it to be viewed in the initial state. I want it to be viewed in the hover state. So overlay, :hover, and then let's be accessible. So we'll call to overlay, :focus for the keyboard users. And the opacity, we bring back with 100%. And there we go. Now, when I hover over it, let's match our button as well and do a box shadow. Box shadow, we'll use our variable of box shadow so it's consistent. There we go, a nice subtle shadow. And then obviously it's taking place like way too quickly, so let's add a transition. So we got to go back to our starting state, the overlay, to add our transition. All 0.5 seconds. And now it's much smoother. So if you want, your opacity to be more or less, you can make it like 0.9 and you barely see the image anymore. If you want it to be less, you could try maybe 0.5 on the RGBA. I liked 0.7. And then I think the text is very legible over that image. Another thing that you could add would be a blur. So it kind of blurs the image. Okay, so for this, it will be a backdrop filter. So something new going on here. Backdrop filter. The kind of filter that we want is a blur. You'll have parentheses, and then you'll basically decide the size of the blur. So 5 pixels blur. We'll blur it quite a bit. If you want it to be blurred even more, you can do a bigger number. If you want it to be blurred less, you could do a smaller number, 3 pixels. So you kind of still see the people's eyes if you want. See what's going on. So do whatever you want, 3 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels, play around. And then I believe that is it for our services section. And since we have a flex wrap on it, it's already responsive. So we barely have to worry about it when it comes to tablet and mobile. But remember, we have to bring back the service title mobile because you cannot hover. I can right now because I'm on a desktop, right? And I've just squished my browser to emulate a tablet or mobile. All right, so in the next one, we are going to style the memberships and then probably also the footer. The footer is not going to take any time at all.